They say kudzu grows a foot a day, fast enough to swallow a broken tractor by June and a whole farmhouse by August. When the county practically gave away 128 choking acres, they thought they'd found a sucker. Instead, they met a woman with nothing to lose and 200 starving goats. The auctioneer's gavel echoed off the peeling plaster walls of the Oconee County Courthouse, sealing a deal that everyone in the room considered a slow, expensive suicide. Sold to the lady in the back for $14,000. Calvin Ford, the county auctioneer, pushed his bifocals down his nose, staring at the woman as if she had just volunteered to step in front of a freight train. Margaret Maggie Sullivan didn't flinch. She walked to the clerk's desk, her hands trembling just enough to make her signature jagged, and handed over a cashier's check that represented exactly 92% of her remaining earthly wealth. At 44, Maggie had lost her Atlanta bakery to a predatory commercial lease, her marriage to a husband who preferred the company of his paralegal, and her pride to a bankruptcy attorney who advised her to just get a job at a grocery store. Instead, she bought the Red Fern Tract. The Red Fern Tract was a legendary piece of real estate off Highway 11, but for all the wrong reasons. It was 128 acres of rolling Piedmont topography that hadn't seen the sun since 1994. It was the epicenter of a kudzu infestation, so profound, so aggressively prehistoric, that locals called it the Green Glacier. The invasive Japanese vine had consumed 50-foot oak trees, collapsed 2 barns, and woven a suffocating, impenetrable blanket over every square inch of the property. The county had acquired it through tax default a decade prior and had been desperately trying to offload it ever since. As Maggie folded the deed into her purse, a shadow fell over her. It was County Commissioner Wallace H. Brantley, a man whose suits always looked slightly too expensive for a public servant's salary. "You're not from around here, Miss Sullivan," Brantley said, his voice dripping with the kind of Southern hospitality that usually precedes a threat. "I admire your spirit, but I feel obligated to inform you of the zoning covenants. That land is zoned agricultural. Under Section 4B of the County Code, you have 24 months to show active, profitable agricultural production. If it remains an unmanaged nuisance property, the county levies a fine of $500 a day." Maggie looked up at him. The county didn't seem to mind the nuisance when they owned it. Brantley's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The county isn't bound by Section 4B. You are. Clear it, farm it, or we will foreclose on the fines, take it back, and you'll be out your $14,000. What Maggie didn't know, what no one outside of Brantley's inner circle knew, was that the Red Fern Tract had recently become incredibly valuable. A massive logistics company was quietly surveying land a mile down the highway for a new distribution hub. Brantley's brother-in-law was a commercial developer who wanted the Red Fern land for a strip mall and truck stop. But the clearing costs for 128 acres of dense, old-growth kudzu were estimated at nearly $250,000. Brantley's scheme was simple. Sell it to a naive outsider, let them sink their money into clearing the top layer, bankrupt them with code fines when they inevitably failed, and seize it back perfectly primed for his developer friends. That afternoon, Maggie drove her beat-up Subaru out back to the property line. She parked on the gravel shoulder of Highway 11 and stood before her new empire. It was terrifying. The kudzu vines were as thick as an anaconda, twisting around each other in fibrous cables that strangled the hardwood trees until they snapped. The landscape looked like a rolling, vibrant green ocean frozen in time. There was no ground visible. There was no horizon, just a towering wall of broad leaves that seemed to whisper in the afternoon breeze. Determined, Maggie hired Donnie Ray, a local contractor with a heavy-duty diesel bush hog. "I need you to cut a path to the center," she told him on a Tuesday morning, handing him a cash deposit. Donnie fired up the massive green John Deere tractor and lowered the spinning blades. He breached the wall of vines with a deafening roar. Leaves shredded, stems snapped, and green mist filled the air. But 10 minutes later, the tractor ground to a violent, screaming halt. Black smoke billowed from the engine. Maggie ran forward as Donnie killed the engine, cursing violently. The kudzu hadn't just tangled the blades, it had woven itself into the undercarriage like steel wire. But that wasn't what stopped the tractor. Hidden beneath 8 feet of vines was the rusted, jagged chassis of a 1970s Ford pickup truck. The bush hog's blades were shattered. "Keep your deposit," Donnie spat, wiping grease from his forehead. "I wouldn't take this job for $1 million. This ain't a farm, lady. It's a graveyard. You can't mow this. You gotta poison it, burn it, and bulldoze the ashes. And even then, it'll come back." Alone on the highway shoulder, Maggie did the math. Herbicide strong enough to kill root crowns across 128 acres would cost upwards of $60,000, money she didn't have, and it would salt the earth, making it impossible to plant the organic apple and peach orchard she had dreamed of. Bulldozing would strip the vital topsoil and cause massive erosion, violating environmental water runoff laws. She was exactly where Commissioner Brantley wanted her, trapped in a green prison with a ticking clock. She sat on the hood of her Subaru and cried until the sun dipped below the tree line. But as the twilight settled, she noticed something. A lone white-tailed deer stepped out of the woods on the opposite side of the highway, walked tentatively to the edge of Maggie's property, and began pulling off mouthfuls of kudzu leaves, chewing contentedly. Maggie wiped her eyes. She pulled out her phone and searched animals that eat kudzu. 2 weeks later, the morning fog over Oconee County was shattered by the grinding gears of 3 massive livestock trailers backing onto the shoulder of Highway 11. Maggie stood at the tailgate of a rusted Dodge Ram, shaking hands with Chester Furlong, a 60-year-old livestock veteran from the mountains of Pickens County. Chester wore denim overalls, chewed on unlit cigars, and looked like a man who had spent his entire life arguing with stubborn animals. "You're crazy, you know that?" Chester rasped, handing Maggie a clipboard with a rental lease agreement. "I've rented my herds out for solar farms and retention ponds. But 128 acres of old-growth kudzu. They might get lost in there and never come out." "Just tell me they'll eat it, Chester," Maggie said, signing the paperwork. "Eat it? Hell, kudzu is a legume. It's got the protein content of high-grade alfalfa. To a goat, this ain't a jungle. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet." Chester unlatched the heavy steel doors of the first trailer. A cacophony of bleats, grunts, and hooves hitting aluminum rang out. Out poured the mercenaries, 200 head of Kiko and Boar Cross goats. They were tough, muscular, and perpetually hungry. Leading them was a massive, scarred wether with curling horns that Chester affectionately called General Sherman. Maggie had spent the last 14 days working 18-hour shifts, dragging heavy-duty solar-powered electric netting through the fringes of the kudzu to create a 3-acre containment paddock. Her hands were blistered, her arms slashed by hidden briars, but the perimeter was hot, pulsing with 7,000 volts of deterrent. General Sherman trotted down the ramp, sniffed the asphalt, and then looked at the towering green wall of the red fern tract. He let out a low bleat. Within seconds, the herd surged forward like a furry tidal wave. They hit the kudzu line and vanished. For a moment, Maggie panicked, thinking she had just released 200 animals into the abyss. But then the noise started. The unmistakable sound of tearing leaves, snapping vines, and furious chewing. The green wall actually began to tremble. "They start from the bottom up," Chester explained, leaning against his truck. "They strip the leaves, which starves the root system of sunlight. Then they eat the vines. Whatever they trample, their hooves churn into the soil, along with their manure. In a week, that 3-acre block will look like a moonscape." For the first month, Maggie lived in a used pop-up camper on the edge of the property. It was grueling work. Every 4 days, as the goats decimated a section, she had to don heavy leather gloves, wade into the cleared muddy wreckage, and move the electric fencing to envelop a new section of the jungle. It was a brutal game of tactical geometry, but it was working. By week 5, the goats had cleared 20 acres. As the green veil was stripped away, the land's secrets were exposed. Maggie found 3 more abandoned cars, a collapsed moonshine still, and, incredibly, the stone foundations of an early 1900s farmhouse. Better yet, the goats' manure was rapidly composting the dead vines, transforming the acidic, suffocated dirt into rich, dark, nitrogen-heavy topsoil. However, the rapid progress did not go unnoticed. Vernon O'Driscoll, whose pristine cattle pasture bordered the northern edge of Maggie's land, drove his truck down to her camper one morning. Vernon was a friend of Commissioner Brantley's, a man who preferred perfectly manicured fescue and considered goats to be the rats of the livestock world. "They stink, Sullivan," Vernon spat through his open window, "and they're loud. If one of those flea bags gets onto my land and gives my Angus herd some kind of parasite, I'll sue you into the Stone Age." "The fence is secure, Mr. O'Driscoll," Maggie replied politely, though her heart pounded. "They are doing exactly what they're supposed to do." "We'll see about that," Vernon muttered, rolling up his window and speeding off. 2 days later, the counties struck. Maggie was moving a water trough when a white Ford Explorer with the county seal pulled up. Out stepped Neil Patterson, an ambitious young code enforcement officer carrying a thick binder. "Maggie Sullivan?" Neil asked, barely looking up from his notes. "I'm issuing a cease and desist. You are in violation of County Ordinance 114B regarding high-density livestock operations. Or you have more than one animal unit per half acre without a commercial feeding permit. You have 48 hours to remove the animals, or they will be impounded at your expense." Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. "Yeah, that ordinance is for commercial feedlots. These are grazing animals on rotational pasture. It's targeted conservation." "Take it up with the zoning board," Neil said, slapping a bright orange sticker on her camper. "Next meeting is in 3 weeks. Until then, the goats have to go." Maggie knew exactly who had pulled this string. Commissioner Brantley was watching her succeed and had decided to change the rules. If she removed the goats for 3 weeks, the kudzu would aggressively regrow, erasing half her progress. If she paid impound fees for 200 goats, she'd be instantly bankrupt. She spent the night furiously reading county legal codes by flashlight. She found a loophole. Ordinance 114B exempted temporary mobile grazing units utilized for designated land clearing. But to prove it, she needed an agricultural extension agent to certify the land. She called the state university the next morning and begged for an emergency inspection. They promised to send someone by Friday. She just had to hold out for 3 more days. But Thursday night brought a storm, not of rain, but of sabotage. Around 2:01 a.m., Maggie awoke in her camper to a strange silence. The low, constant hum of the solar fence charger, a sound she had grown accustomed to, was missing. She grabbed a heavy mag light and stepped out into the humid Georgia night. The beam of her flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the edge of the paddock. The heavy-duty electric netting hadn't failed. It had been cut, sliced clean through with heavy insulated shears, right at the corner closest to Highway 11. Panic seized her chest. She sprinted toward the breach, swinging the flashlight wildly into the darkness. "Sherman!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Sherman, no!" The paddock was completely empty. A quarter-mile away, the screech of heavy truck brakes and the blaring horn of an 18-wheeler shattered the silence on Highway 11. Maggie's blood turned to ice. 200 goats, her entire operation, and her only hope of saving the farm, were wandering onto a 65-mile-per-hour commercial trucking route in the pitch black. Maggie's lungs burned as she sprinted through the damp, knee-high grass bordering the highway, the heavy beam of her mag light bouncing wildly against the tree line. The acrid stench of burning rubber hit her first, followed by the hissing of air brakes. On the shoulder of Highway 11, a massive Peterbilt logging truck sat jackknifed at a 45-degree angle, its headlights illuminating a swirling cloud of dust and exhaust. And there, frozen in the high beams, was a sea of reflective eyes. "Hey!" a voice roared over the idling diesel engine. The driver, a burly man in a high-visibility vest, dropped out of the cab, wielding a heavy tire iron. "Who owns these damn things? I nearly flipped my rig." "I too. I'm so sorry," Maggie gasped. Waving her flashlight, she surveyed the chaos. By some miracle, the driver had locked his brakes in time. The goats were scattered across the asphalt, bleating in sheer panic, completely disoriented by the glaring lights and the roar of the truck. "Lady, you've got 3 minutes before a convoy of freight trucks comes through here blind over that crest," the driver said, his anger shifting instantly to urgent pragmatism. "I'm Dale. How do we move them?" Maggie's mind raced. Goats were prey animals. Chasing them would only scatter them further into the woods, where they would be picked off by coyotes, or lost forever. She needed their commander. "I need a bucket," Maggie said frantically. "Anything that rattles?" Dale ran to his cab side box and pulled out a metal Folgers coffee can, filled with loose bolts and lug nuts. He dumped the hardware onto the grass and handed her the can. Maggie scooped up a handful of loose gravel from the shoulder, dropped it into the tin, and began shaking it rhythmically. Rattle, 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 rattle. It was the universal farm signal for grain. "Sherman!" Maggie yelled into the chaotic night. "Come on, boys, grub time!" For an agonizing 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, from the darkness near the truck's rear axles, a massive set of curling horns emerged. General Sherman stepped into the light, his ears swiveling toward the sound of the tin can. He let out a deep, authoritative bleat. Maggie backed away slowly, shaking the can, stepping carefully toward the breached fence line. Sherman followed. Where the general went, the infantry followed. Slowly, tentatively, the herd of 200 goats flowed off the asphalt and trailed back into the paddock. Dale and Maggie worked together, dragging a heavy fallen oak branch across the cut netting to barricade the gap until morning. As the flashing blue lights of an Oconee County Sheriff's cruiser cut through the fog, Maggie collapsed against the hood of her Subaru, trembling. Deputy Sheriff Carson, a serious man with a graying mustache, inspected the severed fence with his mag light. He traced the clean, synthetic cut on the conductive wires. "This wasn't an animal, Miss Sullivan. Somebody used insulated linesman pliers. They wanted your livestock dead, or they wanted you liable for a multi-vehicle pileup." "I know exactly who wanted this," Maggie whispered. The next morning, the sun rose over a battlefield. Maggie hadn't slept a wink, keeping watch over the herd with a tire iron in her lap. At 8:30 a.m. sharp, a silver state-issued sedan crunched onto her gravel driveway. Out stepped Dr. Harrison Cole, an agricultural extension agent from the state university. Dr. Cole didn't look at Maggie first. He looked at the dirt. He walked past the pop-up camper, knelt in the 20 acres the goats had already decimated, and scooped up a handful of the soil. Where there was once only acidic, dead clay smothered by vines, there was now a layer of rich, dark, nitrogen-dense manure and churned organic matter. Maggie handed him the county citation left by Neil Patterson. Dr. Cole read it, pushed his glasses up, and let out a dry laugh. "High-density commercial feedlot? That's rich," Dr. Cole muttered. He pulled a clipboard from his briefcase and began signing his name with aggressive, looping strokes. "Miss Sullivan, what you are practicing is intensive silvopasture remediation. It's not a nuisance. It's a textbook ecological restoration model. I'm classifying your operation as an essential mobile grazing unit. This overrides any local zoning ordinance." He handed her the golden ticket. "Give my regards to the county commissioner." Maggie delivered the signed certification to the courthouse herself, dropping it squarely on Commissioner Wallace H. Brantley's mahogany desk. The look of quiet, suffocating rage on his face fueled her for the next 6 months. The goats finished stripping the 128 acres by late October, but the war wasn't over. Kudzu survives through massive tuberous root crowns buried deep underground. If left alone, they would sprout again in the spring. Chester Furlong returned, but this time he didn't bring goats. He brought 30 Tamworth hogs. "Pigs are nature's bulldozers," Chester told her, leaning on the fence line. "They smell the sugar in those kudzu tubers. They'll root down 3 feet to get them, churning the soil and breaking up the hardpan clay while they do it." Through the winter, the hogs went to work, violently excavating the remaining root systems. By March, the red fern tract was completely unrecognizable. The suffocating green glacier was gone. In its place lay 128 acres of perfectly tilled, highly fertilized, deeply aerated soil resting under the wide Georgia sky. It was time to plant. 3 years later, the red fern tract had been reborn as Sherman's Ridge Orchard. Where rusted cars and dead trees once sat, pristine rows of 4,000 dwarf apple and peach trees stretched across the rolling hills. Maggie had invested every dime of her remaining credit into high-density trellis systems, planting Honeycrisp, Gala, and Alberta peach varieties. The soil, supercharged by the goat and hog manure, had yielded growth rates that baffled local agronomists. White clover, planted as a cover crop, blanketed the ground, fixing nitrogen and attracting thousands of honeybees. Maggie, now 47, was calloused, deeply tanned, and happier than she had ever been in her life. The orchard was weeks away from its first major commercial harvest. She had secured contracts with 3 regional organic grocers. But Commissioner Brantley had not forgotten her. As the logistics center a mile down the highway finally broke ground, the surrounding land values skyrocketed. Brantley's brother-in-law had lost the chance to build a strip mall on Maggie's land, but Brantley had found a new, far more devastating angle to exact his revenge. On a sweltering Tuesday in July, Maggie found a neon yellow notice tacked to her front gate. Notice of eminent domain seizure. She rushed to the town hall. Brantley sat comfortably at the center of the zoning board table, flanked by lawyers. "It's some matter of public utility, Miss Sullivan," Brantley said smoothly into his microphone, addressing the crowded room. "The new logistics hub requires a high-capacity municipal sewage and drainage line. The most topographically sound road cuts directly through the center of your property. The county is exercising its right to seize a 300-foot right-of-way. We will, of course, compensate you for the acreage at standard agricultural rates." Maggie stared at the map projected on the wall. The proposed pipeline didn't just cut through her land. It violently bisected her entire irrigation grid and would require the bulldozing of her most mature, high-yield peach blocks. It would effectively cripple the orchard, rendering the business financially unviable. Compensation at standard agricultural rates wouldn't even cover the cost of the irrigation pumps she owed the bank. "There's an alternative route along the highway shoulder," Maggie argued, her voice trembling with fury. "You don't need to destroy my farm." "The highway route is too expensive," Brantley replied, smiling with the cold satisfaction of a man who had finally trapped his prey. "The board votes on Friday. I suggest you start preparing for the excavation." Maggie left the hall feeling as though the kudzu had grown back, wrapping tightly around her throat. She had fought the vines, the terrain, the weather, and the sabotage, but she didn't know how to fight the law. That evening, she was sitting on her porch, staring defeatedly at her beautiful trees, when a sleek, black SUV pulled up the driveway. Out stepped Fiona Abbott, a sharp-eyed environmental attorney from Atlanta, who specialized in land use disputes. She had read an article about Maggie's innovative kudzu clearing methods in a statewide farming journal. "I hear the county is trying to steal your life's work," Fiona said, dropping a thick briefcase onto the porch table. "I despise bullies. Let's look at their public filings." For 3 days, Fiona and Maggie dug through county records, environmental impact studies, and obscure zoning maps. What Fiona uncovered was a masterclass in local corruption. The logistics company hadn't requested the sewage line to go through Maggie's property. In fact, their original blueprint had the line running exactly where Maggie suggested, along the highway. Brantley had personally petitioned to move the route. Why? Because the contractor hired to lay the $3 million pipeline was a subsidiary company, quietly owned by Brantley's wife. By routing it through the orchard, the pipeline's length doubled, padding the contractor's payout exponentially at the taxpayer's expense. Furthermore, Dr. Cole's intervention years ago had inadvertently given Maggie a trump card. When he certified the land, he registered the creek running through the bottom of the orchard as a protected agricultural watershed, legally shielded from municipal waste development without a state-level EPA waiver, a waiver Brantley had completely ignored. Friday morning arrived. The Oconee County Courthouse was packed shoulder to shoulder with locals. The tension was palpable. Brantley called the meeting to order, his gavel echoing through the room. "We are here to vote on the Redfern Tract easement." "Before you vote, Commissioner," Fiona Abbott interrupted, standing up from the front row with a stack of bound dossiers. So she walked calmly to the board's table and dropped a copy in front of each member. "What is this?" Brantley snapped. "You don't have the floor." "That is a formal injunction filed an hour ago with the state attorney general," Fiona declared, her voice ringing clear across the silent room. "It outlines your financial connection to the proposed excavation contractor, Commissioner Brantley. It also includes a cease and desist from the State Department of Environmental Protection regarding illegal encroachment on a registered watershed." Brantley's face drained of color. He flipped open the dossier. His eyes darted nervously around the room, meeting the shocked faces of the other board members. "Furthermore," Fiona continued, turning to the crowd, "Miss Sullivan's orchard currently prevents roughly 40 tons of topsoil runoff from flooding Highway 11 during storm season, a service the county used to pay tens of thousands of dollars to manage when the land was abandoned." The crowd erupted into murmurs, which quickly escalated into angry shouts directed at the dais. The locals had watched Maggie bleed and sweat to turn an eyesore into a jewel of the county. They were not about to let a corrupt politician pave over it. The other board members, smelling the political blood in the water and eager to distance themselves from Brantley's self-dealing, hastily called a motion. "Motion to reject the Redfern easement and adopt the highway route." A board member stammered into his microphone. "Seconded," another chimed in instantly. The vote was unanimous against Brantley. 2 weeks later, facing a state ethics investigation, Wallace Brantley quietly resigned from his post, moving out of Oconee County in disgrace. By late August, the air at Sherman's Ridge Orchard was thick with the sweet, intoxicating scent of ripe fruit. The harvest was a triumph. Cars lined up down Highway 11, not to navigate around roaming livestock, but to buy bushels of organic peaches and apples from the massive wooden farm stand Maggie had built near the entrance. Behind the stand, resting comfortably in a lush pasture of fescue and clover, was an old, scarred, and happily retired goat with curling horns. General Sherman chewed thoughtfully on a fallen apple, watching over the empire he had helped conquer. Maggie stood at the counter wiping her brow, handing a bag of perfect golden peaches to a smiling customer. She looked out over the rolling green hills, completely devoid of the suffocating vines that had once defined the land. She hadn't just reclaimed the soil. She had reclaimed her life, proving that sometimes, to clear out the toxic roots of the past, you just need a little stubbornness, a lot of hard work, and an army of hungry goats. If Maggie's relentless fight against corrupt politicians and an impenetrable kudzu jungle inspired you, you know exactly what to do. Hit that like button to show your support for this incredible true-to-life underdog story. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that hard work and creativity can conquer the toughest obstacles. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of resilience, farming triumphs, and unstoppable human spirit. See you next time.